Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. If I could ask everyone to take a seat, please. Good afternoon, honored guests. Before we start our program today, the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 16th Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. At this time, I'd also like to welcome anyone joining the lecture via live stream that is being provided by Real Mensch Studios, especially our own Professor Fiona Schmiegelow and students from our northern partner, Yukon College in Whitehorse. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. The Bentley Lecture Series is named in honor of the late Dr. Fred Bentley, who served over 36 years here in the faculty at the University of Alberta as a professor of soil science and dean of the faculty. Dr. Bentley's work was broad in scope and included work on cropping rotations and agricultural best management practices at the University of Alberta Breton Plots, and internationally with the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in India. He was named as a fellow to 6 scientific societies, including the Royal Society of Canada, received the Alberta Order of Excellence, was appointed as an officer to the Order of Canada, and in 2008 he received the University of Alberta Distinguished Alumni Award, the university's most prestigious award, which recognizes graduates whose truly outstanding achievements have earned them national and international recognition. As Dr. Bentley knew, agriculture is a focal point for issues associated with food production, food security and nutrition, human livelihoods and economic development, energy, climate change, and the environment. It is our hope that the Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture will continue to be a forum for the agricultural community in Alberta and Canada to gather, learn about, and discuss issues related to agriculture, society, and the environment. At this point, I would like to acknowledge members of the Bentley family joining us today. Anne Manson Bentley, daughter of Fred Bentley. In the back there. Welcome. And Sina Handel, granddaughter of Fred Bentley. Let's welcome these family members. This year, we're delighted to have the support of the following financial sponsors: the Alberta Institute of Agrologists, Alberta Barley, Alberta Canola, Alberta Pulse Growers, Alberta Milk, Bayer Crop Science, Dow AgroSciences, Koch Agronomic Services, Sunterra, and as well the University of Alberta Bentley Lecture Endowment and the Department of Renewable Resources and the Faculty of Ailes. We are delighted with the support we have received, and please join me in applauding their contribution. Before we commence, I'd like to bring your attention to the following. First, a few words about the Bentley Lecture Endowment. The University of Alberta Bentley Lecture Endowment was established in 2015 and provides an opportunity for anyone who is interested to contribute to this important lecture series. More information about the endowment is available. You can ask me or any University of Alberta staff in the theater afterwards. Second, I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the hard work done by AIL's staff and volunteers that makes an event like the Bentley Lecture possible. Specifically, I would like to thank Sharon Katzeff, AIL's Public Relations Manager, Mike Abley and Brett Finch, AIL's IT staff that worked with Real Mensch to make the live stream possible, Rihanna Bennett, Executive Assistant in the faculty, Sarah Gooding, Assistant Chair in the Department of Renewable Resources, and Christine Nohos, Office Manager in the Department of Renewable Resources, as well as many volunteers, graduate student and undergraduate student volunteers. Thank you. Finally, I would like to remind everyone that following the lecture, we will have time for questions from the audience. Following the questions, there will be a poster session outside of the lecture theater showcasing AIL's graduate student research in sustainable agriculture and related areas. Now I'd like to call on Dr. Stan Blade, Dean of the Faculty of Agricultural Life and Environmental Sciences, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. This is sort of like, a parent and children. I can't say that the Bentley Lecture is my favorite, or I will get in trouble, but the fact is that when I look across the crowd and people that I've met that are participating, not only here in the audience, but certainly our friends and colleagues up at UConn College and Whitehorse, other people that are watching the live stream, it's just amazing the diversity of people that want to come to hear the Bentley Lecture, and I see that as a very reassuring thing. Certainly would like to echo Miles's comments with respect to all of our thanks to sponsors, to people that have helped us to do this, and I would particularly point out, and I would very much encourage you to spend some time with our graduate students in the poster session after the lecture as well, because you'll see a wide diversity of activity, of research going on within our faculty that'll give you a real sense of the sorts of things that are happening. Right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Clapp. We very much appreciate that Jennifer has come to join us today to give the 16th Bentley Lecture. Jennifer has a remarkable academic record, having done a PhD, originally an MSc at the London School of Economics. She has a remarkable array of awards. I would just pick out two as an elected member of the Royal Society of Canada and as a Trudeau Fellow, a recipient of a Trudeau Fellowship. And she's published two books amongst many other published activities, but two that I would point out specifically. Food, that was published in 2012 by Polity Press, and Hunger in the Balance, the New Politics of International Food Aid, that was published by Cornell University Press. So it's a tremendous resource for us to have Dr. Clapp here today, and I would welcome her to give her lecture, and please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I just wanted to say how pleased I am to be here today and very honored to have been invited to deliver the 16th Bentley Lecture. And it's especially important to me to know that Fred Bentley was really passionate about international development and sustainable food systems. And these are interests I very much share. And although he was a natural scientist and I'm a social scientist, and I understand maybe one of the few social scientists who's had the pleasure to speak in this series, I think that sustainability in food systems is one of those issues where social scientists and natural scientists really need to learn more from each other and to work together, because these are big, complex problems that are facing humanity, and we have to put all hands on deck to deal with these very complicated issues. And with that in mind, I will be speaking about a very complicated issue today. I want to speak about a global issue that has generated enormous controversy in recent years, which is the consolidation of corporations in the agri-food sector, and in particular the agricultural input sector. And I realized I haven't put this forward here. Obviously my title, Mega Mergers on the Menu. Corporate concentration and the politics of sustainability. And what I'd like to do in the lecture is give an overview of some of the big debates around this particular issue that have galvanized the public interest in recent years, and highlight some of the issues for sustainability as well as for public policy. So what I'd like to do is focus my comments today in this lecture around three key questions. And these questions are, first, what are the forces behind the current wave of mergers in the agri-food sector? Second, in what ways does corporate consolidation matter for sustainability in the food system? And finally, what are the implications of this debate for public policy? And in answering these questions, I'll give you a bit of a preview of what I'm going to do, because in case I speak too long and Miles will cut me off, I better give you the punchline first. But I want to make three big points. The first point is that the mergers today are a product not just of technological innovations, which have driven past mergers, but also peculiar and particular heightening of financial incentives that have really encouraged firms in the agri-food sector to engage in merger and acquisition activity. The second point I want to make is that the debate over sustainability implications of these mergers is highly, highly polarized. And my intention in the lecture today is not to try to adjudicate this debate. Rather, it is to give an overview of the different perspectives. It's very polarized, and in a sense, I just want to say that I think a lot of what's going on in the farm fields across Canada and around the world is somewhere in the messy middle. So it's important to understand these different perspectives, but it's also important to learn from each other and to think about how that relates to the real world. And finally, the final point I want to make is that the policy process dealing with mergers in the agri-food system, interestingly, hasn't really paid that much attention to questions of sustainability. And that's despite the fact that the sustainability issues are among the most publicized, let's say, in the media today. So it's a bit of a puzzle, and I want to explain why that is. Okay, so first off, the first question, what are the forces behind the current wave of mergers in the agri-food sector? Answering this question requires us to step back a bit and get a bit of history and background to understand the current era. So if we think about what was going on prior to, say, the 1930s, farmers were typically saving their seeds, exchanging them with their neighbors. And in the early 20th century, we started to see independent seed companies emerge, selling certified quality seeds to farmers. But these seeds were often developed in the public domain, funded by government-funded research. And it wasn't necessarily like there was this seed industry that was super profitable. In other words, it was more like governments providing a public good. But then in the 1930s, we saw the development of hybrid seeds. And hybrid seeds really were important because they outperformed traditional varieties in terms of yield. But what's interesting about hybrid seeds, as I'm sure many of you are aware, while they can deliver high yields, those yields don't perform year after year if you save your own seed. You have to continue to buy new seed in order to have the higher yield benefits. So this, in a way, sort of put intellectual property protection right into the seed itself, and that encouraged more and more private companies to get interested in seed research. So in other words, seeds became more profitable because there was this guarantee that you could sell them every year, and therefore seed companies became more and more interested in undertaking research and development. Now, and I'm going through this really, really quickly, but in the years that followed, what we saw was government policies creating a sense of a greater intellectual property protection for seeds through various policy mechanisms. For example, UPOV, the Union for the Protection of Seed Varieties, established in the 1960s. In the US, there was a Plant Variety Protection Act, also guaranteeing intellectual property for plants and plant breeders. There was the Plant Breeders' Right Act in Canada in 1990, and the World Trade Organization's trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, the TRIPS agreement, which also guaranteed greater property rights over seeds and genetic properties. So the result of this greater intellectual property protection through policy sort of built on that intellectual property protection in the seed from hybrids, and what it did is created a sort of international regime that gave rights to the developers of seeds. And so the result of this greater intellectual property protection, what that means is that those who were developing the seeds had a period of time, under some mechanisms it was 20 years, other mechanisms maybe 25 years, where they had exclusive rights to those seeds and could sell them at a higher rate. So what happened when we saw this greater intellectual property protection was more and more interest of the private sector in developing new and improved seeds. And as that occurred, we started to see companies getting larger and larger. And the reason for that was, in part, it's very expensive to undertake research in plant genetic improvements, and therefore the companies needed to, in a sense, get bigger in order to have the budget to engage in research and development. And in the 1970s, we started to see chemical companies getting interested in seed companies. And this was an interesting period because it was a time when environmental regulations were getting more stringent, especially in North America, and huge capital costs for the developers of agricultural chemicals like pesticides and herbicides. And it was expensive for them to run their operations, and they started to see that the seed industry might have some profitability for them. So in the 1970s, we started to see what we would call the first wave of mergers between chemical and seed companies. And then by the mid-1990s, we started to see, I would say, a dizzying array of mergers that started to happen. And this occurred alongside the development of agricultural biotechnology, or genetically modified seeds, where what we saw was a real interest in the seed companies and the chemical companies getting together because they were developing seeds that were resistant to the very chemicals that they were selling. So for example, today it's something like 85% of all genetically modified seeds are actually resistant to the brand of herbicide that the seed company has also developed. So there was a real connection then between the seed and chemical industry, especially with the advent of agricultural biotechnology. So it was around this period, between around mid-1990s and around 2010, that we saw what we call the formation of the Big Six. And that's the Big Six agricultural seed and chemical companies through an array of mergers. And I love this diagram. I borrowed this from the US Department of Agriculture, but I find it's a great way to sort of quickly show who was buying whom. And as you can see, we ended up with these 6 companies: Bayer, Syngenta, Monsanto, DuPont, Dow, and BASF. And they were purchasing agricultural biotechnology startup companies. They were purchasing independent seed companies. And in a sense, they were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So when we call them the Big Six, it's important to understand just how big the Big Six are. And this slide shows that in 2013, the market was almost $100 billion a year if we add the seeds and chemicals together. And you can see the market share of each of the 6 companies, and you can see what the others were all about. But in a sense, what we see is that the 6 companies together had 75% of the global pesticide market and about 62% of the global seed market. So really big companies that we had developed by that time, by around 2010. So they were very, very dominant in the marketplace. So that's the history lesson, quickly getting us to the point of the current mergers and where we're at right now and why they're happening. I just want to give you an overview of what those mergers look like. So what we saw in late 2015, there was an announcement that Dow and DuPont were planning to do a merger. They called it a merger of equals. This was a $130 billion deal that these 2 companies were coming together. And the aim of this particular merger was to bring these expertise of these 2 companies together and then split into 3 independent companies, one focused on materials and one focused on agricultural sciences, et cetera. So that was the first one that was announced. And what's interesting is the announcement of this particular merger actually followed some earlier moves where Monsanto and BASF were in talks and with Syngenta. And so people had a sense that there was going to be some turbulence in the sector. It just wasn't clear how it was going to shake out. So Dow DuPont was the first. Then just a few months later, in February 2016, ChemChina announced its purchase of Syngenta. for around $43 billion. And this was a bit of a surprise, but also a bit of, in a sense, showing us the reality of China's place in the world economy, and China really stepping up with a national agrochemical company, really looking to branch out and own a piece of Syngenta, which is based in Europe. Then once these first two mergers were announced, there was a lot of speculation about what was going to happen next, a lot of talks going on between different potential corporate matchups. But in the end, what we saw was Bayer announcing in September 2016 that it was planning to purchase Monsanto for around $66 billion. And this was, again, a huge development because Bayer and Monsanto are each in and of themselves quite large if you look at the big six, and there they are planning to form a company together, which is quite large. Now, in the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on these three mergers in particular in the agricultural input industry and seeds and chemicals, but I should mention that there are other mergers going on in the agri-food sector that have different histories and particular dynamics, but are no less important. One being the Agrium Potash merger that was announced in 2016 and was recently approved and completed, and I believe that on the start of this year, it's now a new company called Nutrien, which is I believe the largest fertilizer company now in the world. As well, in the news just in the last couple of days, there's been information that Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, a major grain trading company, is seeking to buy Bunge, which is one of the top 4 grain trading companies in the world. And if those two companies come together, it could be really interesting because that sector is already dominated by about 4 or 5 companies, similar to what's going on in the seed and chemical industry. So there's a lot going on in the sector, and I could go on and on, like the Kraft-Heinz merger and others in food processing and food retail. It's a big trend in the agri-food system that we're seeing more and more consolidation. So it's important to understand what is going on, why is this happening, and what does it mean. So I want to go in a little bit, as I said, to talk about the first 3 of these mergers and what is happening in the sector. And when I first started researching into this issue, my key question was, is this just, is this similar? Is it continuing that pattern of technological development, intellectual property protection that drove mergers in the past? Is that what's going on right now? And in the course of my research, I realized, yes, to some extent, but that's not the entire story. But I do want to talk a little bit about the tech. First off, what we are seeing, if we look at this diagram, which I pulled from the Bloomberg website, we see that if these mergers, and 2 of them I should mention have already been approved, the Dow DuPont has been approved, that the deal is completed, ChemChina Syngenta is already completed, it's the Bayer Monsanto that is still under review. But assuming these mergers were going through as planned, Bloomberg put this together, and I think it shows very nicely that what we see is some of these companies were more involved in chemicals and some were more involved in seeds, and once they were matched up, it would be a more even distribution of seed and chemical expertise across fewer companies, fewer bigger companies, but a more even technological mix. So that's quite interesting to see that this is perhaps a bit more of that continued technological integration that we saw with the advent of genetically modified seeds. But what I was also curious, because this was happening, but we didn't have any kind of preceding strengthening of intellectual property right protection for seeds like we'd seen in the past. So before there were these, Plant Variety Protection Act and the WTO TRIPS agreement, et cetera, there was nothing like that that preceded these particular mergers. But what's interesting is there is a different way in which intellectual property protection has become very interesting for these companies, and I would say that is the advent of digital farming. Now, digital farming is, I'm sure many of you are aware of what digital farming is, but basically the development of platforms, including both hardware and software, that develop mechanisms for precise delivery of inputs on farmers' fields in what the companies are calling integrated solutions. So in a sense, it's using satellite equipment, detailed maps, GPS, GIS, et cetera, in order to offer prescriptions on farmers' fields. And I would say that this kind of development is a new kind of intellectual property protection, because what's interesting here is that it's the prescription. It's the idea that how much you should, how much of which seeds you should plant where, how much of which chemicals should be applied in which parts of your field, according to which conditions. That in itself is a kind of information that the companies themselves, if they develop this technology, can hold, and that gives them, in a sense, a right to sell that information to farmers at a profit. So that's an intellectual property protection that would be quite interesting to these firms. So here I would say intellectual property protection is important, but in a different way than it had been in the past. And that's not to say that these companies aren't still working on developing higher yield seeds or developing better integrated chemicals and high yielding seeds, et cetera, but they're doing it alongside this new kind of farming known as digital farming. But in a sense, I think this is not the entire story. I think a big part of the story also has to do with the economic conditions that we face in the world today. And I wanted to put up this graph from the Financial Times, which shows the global volumes of mergers and acquisitions across the entire world economy. And if we look at this, we can see that the year 2015 was a record. And that's the year when these mergers started to be announced. And then for 3 years in a row, and we could add the fourth year, I couldn't find the 2017, but it's also over $3 trillion. These are years in which we're seeing a high number of mergers and acquisitions across a range of sectors. And so this is very interesting, that it's not just agriculture. So in a way, I wasn't satisfied with an argument that saying it was technology alone. I think the economic situation has very much to do with it. And I would point out that we are in an era where many people would say we are living in what they call a financialized world economy. And what does that mean, to have a financialized world economy? It basically is referring to the growing importance of financial markets, financial motives, financial institutions in determining decisions that get made in the world economy today. So there's a whole growth of literature on this topic of financialization, and it's basically pointing out that financial imperatives tend to be driving many of the decisions that we face today, rather than other kinds of motives, like protecting the environment or ensuring income inequality, et cetera. Instead, what we're seeing is decisions being made increasingly in order to satisfy shareholders who are investors in companies. And this I think, helps us to explain a lot about why the mergers and acquisitions are happening across a range of sectors today, is this process of financialization and the prioritization of shareholder value. And the agricultural sector is not immune to this, and I want to take a little bit of time to explain why, in particular, these kinds of economic trends played a big role in the timing of these particular mergers. So first, I just want to point to the fact that, as I'm sure you are aware, that we had a food crisis with hugely high food prices, commodity prices in 2007, 8, 9, and those high prices remained until about 2012, mid-2012, and there was drought out west. Prices were remaining high and very volatile, but then they started to slide. So after 2012, 2013, agricultural commodity prices started to fall, and they started to fall quite sharply in a sense that what we saw was a declining demand for the kinds of agricultural inputs that these big companies were selling. And the reason for that is the commodity price crash that happened. It hit Latin America particularly hard, where agriculture is a big part of activity in Brazil and Argentina. And these are some of the biggest markets for agrochemicals today. I think Brazil is the largest market for pesticides, for example. And so when these economies were feeling the pinch from declining agricultural commodity prices, the demand that farmers had for the inputs started to slip. And when the demand for those products started to slip, that hurt the profitability of these companies. So what we saw is most of the big six companies that were engaging in merger activity, they were, if you look at the financial markets, they were actually underperforming the standard, what we call the Standard & Poor Index, which is kind of like, the basic how is the economy doing. These companies were performing a little bit below that. And when that happens, shareholders tend to get a little annoyed and they want to have higher dividends, for example. So they start to push companies to do something to increase revenue. So how can they do that? Mergers and acquisitions is one way that companies can increase their share prices. So this started to explain a little bit about what the timing was in these particular mergers. And if we add to that this phenomenon of what we call activist investors. And when I say activist investors, I'm not talking about, activists out in the streets with banners and protesting. No, activist investors in the financial world is referring to certain investors who acquire enough shares in a particular company to have a bit of say on the board about the activity of that company. So activist investors, companies don't usually like activist investors because they buy up a whole bunch of shares and then they demand a seat on the board, and then they start to demand changes at the company. And we saw this in particular in the Dow and DuPont case, where Nelson Peltz, who's a renowned activist investor, used to be a corporate raider in his earlier days, and Daniel Loeb, who is the head of the Third Point hedge fund. So these guys are both hedge fund managers. They have deep pockets, a lot of money, and over the course of 2014 or so, they started to acquire significant shares in Dow and DuPont, and they started to demand corporate changes. And it's interesting that they were calling for these kinds of changes, and within months there was a shakeup in leadership at the company, and the merger was announced. So that's quite interesting, and I would say quite a direct example of the way in which these kind of financial incentives really played a role in the timing of these particular mergers. But it's not just these guys, the activist investors, that are important. What's really interesting in some of the research that I've been doing is around this question of what we call common shareholder ownership. And what this basically is referring to is there are these large, what they're called as asset management companies. These are companies, so if you have a pension fund or a pension through your employment, usually these pensions are, in a sense, managed and purchased products through these kinds of asset management companies. So they have names like you may have heard of: BlackRock, Capital Group, Fidelity, Vanguard, State Street. I mean, these are sort of these big companies that manage lots and lots of money. And what they do is they sell you products. So for example, they might sell a retirement savings product, and then what they do to hedge that thing that they sold you is actually buy shares in these companies. So they index the product they sell to you, and then they own the shares in the companies. And when I was able to get access to this data, it was really, really fascinating to me to see that 6 big asset management companies own 6 big agricultural and chemical companies, to the tune of 15, 20, 30%. So in the case of DuPont, for example, a third of the shares of that company is owned by large asset management companies that are managing money of basically people saving for their pensions. And it's an interesting issue, because normally we would say that money that is saved for pension savings is passive investors. Like, I'm a passive investor if I'm not close to retirement age yet, so when I invest my money, it's for the long run. But the managers of those funds are actively pressuring companies all the time to change practices, because they are evaluated based on immediate returns. And so it's a situation where we're talking about lots and lots of money, and it's a lot of money, trillions and trillions of dollars in the global economy being managed by these big asset management companies that are basically owning the companies that we're talking about in the food and agriculture sector. So that's an example, I would say, of what we would call financialization, where these financial motives tend to be driving some of the outcomes in the sector, rather than other kinds of motives. Now, if we add on to that one more piece of interesting information, after the financial crisis of 2008, we also saw governments around the world frantically trying to prop up economies, and one of the key ways they did this was by lowering the interest rate. They lower the interest rate to try and make it more attractive to borrow money so that companies wouldn't be going under, people wouldn't be losing their jobs, et cetera. But what we saw then was this long period, 7-8 years, of extremely low interest rates. I think we're only starting, the Bank of Canada has recently started to raise the interest rates again, but we're only just coming out of that. So what does that mean when the interest rates are really low? It means that it's very, very easy for corporations to borrow lots and lots of money because it's really cheap. Interest rates have been extremely low. The Financial Times has called this situation, I love this quote, a heady cocktail of ultra-low financing and a search for growth. Basically what they're saying is that companies are finding it easy to borrow money to buy their rivals. It's a way to quickly shore up their share prices and satisfy their shareholders. And if we look at the case of these agribusiness mega mergers, two of the cases in particular fit this criteria very well. The Bayer-Monsanto deal and the ChemChina-Syngenta deal were both highly leveraged. In other words, the companies were borrowing money to make the acquisition. The case of Dow DuPont is different. That was a share swap. It was a genuine merger. But in this case, we're seeing that ChemChina's debt will now be 9.5 times its annual earnings, and for Bayer, it will be around 4 times its annual earnings in order to complete these deals. So these companies are borrowing on cheap credit in order to make these deals happen. So I would say that it's this combination then of technological integration of seeds and chemicals, it's new intellectual property wrapped up in high-tech digital farming, and unique set of financial circumstances in the global economy, and in particular, the way they're affecting the agri-food sector that led to the timing and the scope of these particular mergers at this particular time. So that's the first question, what is driving this? Now, I want to turn now to talk about the second question, which is, in what ways does this corporate consolidation matter for sustainability in the food system? In other words, why is this important? This is a lecture on sustainable agriculture. Why does it matter? I would say it matters a lot. And what's really interesting about this question is it sparks vastly different viewpoints from different people along the perspective. It's a very heated debate. And I would say it's inextricably tied to wider debates that we've seen not just in the public sphere, but in academic literature, about what is the right path to deliver more sustainability in the food system. On the one hand, some would argue we need to make improvements to the kind of large-scale conventional agriculture that dominates in much of Western industrialized countries today, versus others who say, no, we need a more small-scale agriculture that's more suited to developing countries, which is where we see more people, and that's where we need to address hunger more squarely. So those two viewpoints, I would say, I hope I'm not feeding the binary too much, but they're exemplified. Here we have a picture of the Bayer and Monsanto CEOs shaking hands at the announcement of the merger. On the one hand, arguing that these mergers are going to be a positive net benefit for sustainability. And I'll explain in a minute what the argument is here. But it's a basic argument that the firms need to be bigger in order to afford the research and development that we need to develop a more sustainable agriculture in the future. But that contrasts against this view, which this is a picture from a protest in Europe, that a lot of the NGOs across Europe have been protesting the Bayer-Monsanto merger, which they call a marriage from hell. So as you can see, this is why they're dressed in a wedding outfit. And they're very much against this kind of merger because they would argue that we need to have that more small scale, what they would say, agroecological food production. Now, as I said, I'm not going to try to adjudicate this debate. My aim in this talk is not to come down on one side or the other, but to give the overview so that we can have a more reasoned and sensible debate about these two perspectives. And as I said at the start, there's many viewpoints in between. These are just the extreme ends of this particular debate. Okay, so I'm going to start with those who would argue that corporate consolidation has positive net benefits for sustainability. And in fact, I would say that this is, if you read the literature of the companies that are merging, this is one of the primary reasons that they give for why these companies are merging at this time. So it's not that sustainability is a side point for these firms, it's front and center. And I would say that the supporters of the mergers basically are making the case that modern technology, as we look forward to the future, we're going to need to embrace it for agriculture. So they're very optimistic about the future possibilities of modern technology. And they also tend to embrace the idea of efficiency and resource efficiency in particular. And these are key components of their rationale for why corporate consolidation can deliver more sustainable agriculture. So I'm just going to give three interrelated parts of these arguments on each side. So I'll start with this particular side. Basically making the point that corporate consolidation is necessary to enable firms to develop products to meet the world's future food demands. This is consistent across those companies and advocates of corporate consolidation. They frequently reference the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, very respectable organization, which has put forward the prediction that we need to increase food production by 50 to 60% by the year 2050, which is not that far away. And they argue that, wow, if we need to increase food production by 50 to 60% in just a couple of decades, we need to get on it, but we also need to do it sustainably. Because if in the past we've increased food production by expanding the area under cultivation, and this has been associated with all kinds of environmental problems like biodiversity loss from deforestation, et cetera. So they argue that if we're going to increase food production by this amount, we have to do it on the same amount of land that's currently under cultivation, or we're looking at an environmental catastrophe. So, and this is often referred to in the literature as the sort of land-sparing kind of approach, which is, in other words, you spare some land, you leave it wild, and then you cultivate the land that's dedicated to agriculture, but you have to increase the yields markedly on the land that is currently being cultivated. But the argument is that if we take this kind of land-sparing approach, and if we need to increase food production, we have to raise yields. The only way to do that is with high-tech modern agriculture that brings more resource efficiency. Which brings us to the second point here, which is that the high-tech agriculture is perfectly suited to improving resource use efficiency. So what's interesting here in this particular part of the argument is that the agricultural input companies are quite open about the fact that in the past, the expansion of agriculture and the use of agrochemicals, for example, has had some negative environmental implications. And one of those has been the overuse of certain chemicals. So if you've done reading about pesticides, you know there's a lot of concern about their overuse and the problem of herbicide-resistant weeds, and et cetera. So what the big agri-food input companies have been arguing is that the use of drones and satellites, et cetera, enables the ability to produce equipment that gives farmers the information they need so that they can spray much more precisely. They'll only spray the chemicals that are needed exactly where they're needed, which will reduce the incidence of herbicide-resistant weeds, for example. It will also reduce overall spraying of pesticides. It can also be useful in determining, taking soil samples and checking satellites, climate conditions, knowing exactly how much to irrigate, et cetera. This can be very useful for conserving resources for agriculture. So this is a big part of the argument then. So we're building that there's this need to increase food production, but we also have to do it more sustainably and use our resources more efficiently. And a third part of this perspective basically argues that this kind of agriculture is basically more what we would call climate smart. It's enabling an agriculture that is more able to adapt to a changing climate. And as you know, we are experiencing unprecedented climate change to the extent that it's going to be affecting agricultural production. I mean, some countries are going to be far more harmed by this process than others. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are predicted to see serious loss in crop productivity as a result of climate change. And if we take this high-tech approach, it would create a better ability to adapt to that kind of climatic change. So this kind of approach then allows, it also allows for more low-till agriculture that, again, releases less carbon into the atmosphere. So there's multiple ways in which this model of agriculture is more environmentally sustainable. Now, and this kind of vision has been promoted by the companies that are merging. It's also been promoted by others who are in favor of a large-scale, what some would call sustainable intensification or climate-smart agriculture. And it's a very powerful vision that's been put forward that I would say the key characteristics are it embraces the potential of technology, it's forward-looking, and it's promising resource efficiency. But that's just one perspective. So as you know, there is another side to this argument that has voiced a lot of concern about this particular model and basically maps out a completely different path towards sustainability in the food system. And that, I would put here the voice of the critics, the views of the critics, and basically their perspective tends to be a little more skeptical, or maybe a lot more skeptical, about the promises of technology looking forward. Instead, they tend to look back at previous waves of mergers in the sector, corporate consolidation, for example, from the 1990s to the early 2000s, was all about the spread of genetically modified seeds, the greater use of chemicals, et cetera. And so those coming from a more critical perspective are a lot more skeptical of the promise of technology. They also promote a vision of sustainable agriculture based more on what I would call sovereignty, or food sovereignty, if you like, which is really about prioritizing farmers' rights to choose the kind of farming system that they would like. And it's also based on diversity of farming systems, which is different from the large-scale approach taken by those who advocating consolidation. So again, I just want to talk about three of the key interrelated points from this particular perspective that characterize their critique of large-scale sustainable agriculture and their vision of what should replace it. So first off, I would say that this perspective is interestingly standing up to this whole claim by the Food and Agriculture Organization that we need to increase food production by 50 to 60% by the year 2050. They basically argue that we don't need more food on the planet today. We currently produce enough food to feed around 10 billion people, according to their analyses. The problem isn't about production, it's about distribution. And this is a long debate that's been taking place in the area of food security, is how we address hunger. And so from this perspective, they would argue that increasing yields is not the way to address hunger. It is rather to deal with that problem of distribution, and in particular, help work with farmers in areas of the world that are experiencing hunger in order to increase their production rather than these kind of large-scale farming in industrialized countries, which is what most of the solutions coming from the big companies are focused on. In addition, we could say that, you know, the problem of hunger today, it's interesting. We've got around 1 billion people who are undernourished. We've got around 2 billion people who are malnourished, but that includes people who are overweight and obese, for example. And so they would argue, you know, and add to that, we're wasting about 1/3 of the world's food production. If we put that picture together, they say we don't need these higher yields. And they would also argue that it's small-scale farmers who are already feeding the world. So if you've followed the group the work of the Et cetera group, which is based in Ottawa, they have been putting forward an argument that 70% of the world's population is being fed currently by small-scale farmers. The world currently has around 500 million small-scale farms. They say they feed 70% of the world's population. There's a bit of a debate about this. But it's interesting. They say that we don't need to increase that production. And what they're worried about is that the vision that's put forward by those promoting consolidation is that it narrows the choices of farmers to choose the kind of farming that they want to do. So in other words, they say it's threatening small-scale farmers by only offering these very expensive, high-tech kinds of farming models that many small-scale farmers simply can't afford. So there's a difference here then in terms of even the basic assumptions between these two perspectives about what the problem is and how we approach it. From this perspective, there's also a lot of concern about chemical use. From this perspective, people are often pointing to the fact that the use of certain chemicals, for example, the herbicide glyphosate has increased markedly in the last 25 years. I've already mentioned 85% of GM crops today are engineered to be resistant to herbicides. And so as GM acreage has increased over the last 25 years, it's not surprising that the use of glyphosate has increased along with it. At the initial unveiling of glyphosate, it was marketed as a relatively benign pesticide. It was less toxic than some other alternatives, yet what we've seen in the last 25 years with the increased application of this particular herbicide is growing concern about its safety. So the World Health Organization a couple of years ago announced that they say glyphosate is probably carcinogenic. I don't know what the probably, why they've got probably in there. It's partly because it's being very contested by advocates of the use of glyphosate. And this is the active ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup, if you're not familiar with that. So what we've seen then is this growing use of glyphosate and then the development of weeds that are resistant to the spraying of glyphosate. So as we see more and more weed resistance, what we're seeing then is a greater application of older, more toxic chemicals to deal with some of the persistent weed problems. So critics are saying, if we were promised 25 years ago that glyphosate was a more environmentally friendly pesticide, they say, well, we didn't see that play out the way that it was promised to us, so how can we expect the promises of new technology to play out that way today? So big concerns there about chemical use. And a third key argument that is being made by those who are against consolidation is they argue that the kinds of farming methods promoted by the large companies are basically damaging to crop genetic resources and to the climate. So again, very opposite of the arguments from the other side, but for different reasons. The argument with respect to crop genetic diversity has a lot to do with the monocultural planting systems. So planting the same crop in large fields, a single crop, has been, according to the FAO, associated with a dramatic decline in crop genetic diversity. Crop genetic diversity, according to the FAO, has dropped by 75% in the century from 1900 to 2000. So that's quite a dramatic decline. And the critics are also publishing really interesting scientific papers, basically arguing that land sparing does not necessarily improve biodiversity. In fact, it can increase it. They argue that instead mixed farming systems, what they call land sharing, can actually be better for biodiversity. So land sharing is basically referring to planting systems that are intercropping and blending forests with food production, and that this can increase wildlife and insects and other kinds of biodiversity. And finally, there are also really interesting studies coming from the field of agroecology showing that small-scale agroecological production, which is not reliant on large-scale inputs, can be carbon-absorbing rather than carbon-emitting. So Again, these three arguments together really reflect a different kind of worldview coming from this perspective. It's more pessimistic about the modern technology based on past experience, from which they're skeptical, and they're prioritizing issues like farmers' sovereignty as well as ecological diversity as the pathway to sustainability. Again, very different perspective. Okay, so I want to pivot now to the final point of my presentation, which is what does all this mean for public policy and for governance? And just to stress, like, mergers don't just happen. Companies can't just say we're merging. I mean, they did make these announcements, but they're not allowed to actually proceed with a merger unless they get some kind of approval from a government regulatory authority. And what's interesting is that although these companies are transnational in scope, all of the companies engaged are transnational corporations, there's no global mechanism that governs these mergers. It's all done at the domestic level. So what we've seen then is domestic regulators around the world are the ones making the decisions about whether these companies can merge. And the approvals, in these cases, it's around 30 jurisdictions around the world. It's based on the countries in which the companies we're talking about have business operations. So for example, Canada's Competition Bureau evaluated all three mergers. The US, the European Union, Brazil, South Africa, these are the big jurisdictions that are making these kinds of decisions. And the main focus of competition bureaus around the world at this domestic level is basically traditional questions of antitrust and competition. The basic concern is if there are fewer, larger firms dominating a market, that this can have negative implications for innovation, and it can have negative implications for prices. In other words, if there's more firms and they don't have any incentive to innovate, this could lead to higher prices. So this could be bad for consumers, bad for farmers in this particular case. And so what they tend to do is evaluate the mergers based on what the likely outcome is going to be for economic competition within the marketplace. So it's not, and I want to take a little bit of time to explain how they do this, because I think it's really interesting, and I think we need to know more about it, like as citizens. And luckily, competition bureaus around the world publish their guidelines, which is great. They're a bit technical, but I think there's some important pieces of information we should know. But first, just to say, it's not as simple as adding up the market shares of the companies before they merged and then adding them together and saying, wow, they're going to dominate the market. That tends to be the kind of approach we see in the media when people are concerned about the mergers. It's like, oh boy, this company has 30% and that company's got 10%. They're going to come together and they're going to have 40% of the market. It doesn't actually work in that simple way in terms of the way that either that they end up merging or the way they get evaluated. So what we see is that regulators tend to use really specific metrics to measure the likely market competition effects of a merger. Two measures in particular tend to dominate around the world. One is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or the HHI, and the other is called the CR4, the concentration ratio of the top 4 firms in a sector. And Canada, for example, relies on the CR4 in its competition guidelines, but many of the other countries around the world rely on the HHI. And that's a research question I still have to answer, is why Canada uses the CR4 and others use a mix, but they mostly rely on this other. Now, the HHI is an interesting metric. It basically is the sum of the market, it's the sum of the square of the market share of each participant in the marketplace. So you have to know how many firms are in the marketplace and what their market share is, and then you square that market share and you add it up. So if there's one firm dominating the entire market, it's 10,000. If there's thousands of firms, the HHI could be close to 0. So that's one way in which they measure it. And this is Alberto Hirschman, one of my economic heroes here. I couldn't find a picture of Herfindahl, so you get to see Hirschman. And he's done many interesting things, among them defining this particular way of measuring market concentration. And the CR4, as I said, is just the market share of the top 4 firms in the sector. Now, competition authorities typically consider an HHI analysis over 2,500 to be highly concentrated, and a CR4 over 65 to be highly concentrated. But what's interesting is that they don't just do the math and it's really quick and then they make a decision. It's way more complicated than that. This is just a guide. It's not a foregone conclusion that if they do this analysis and it's over 65 or it's over 2,500 that they're going to stop a merger. It basically depends on a host of factors. And so one of those things that it depends on is actually something that many competition bureaus call an efficiency exception. And I think this is interesting, and it probably came into play with the agribusiness mergers. So the efficiency exception basically means that if you end up with a highly concentrated market, but the firms can prove to you that they're going to result in so much efficiency that it will create more innovation in the sector and put prices down, they'll actually be more inclined to approve a merger than to challenge it. So that's kind of interesting. It's a guide. The market concentration issue is a guide, but efficiency also plays a role. So they're clearly prioritizing efficiency, and you can see how that can happen. If companies merging together have such an economy of scale that, if they produce things in a bigger scale, that it actually makes it cheaper per unit of production, it really could lower prices. But on the other hand, you could also see it raising prices if the firms collude with one another and decide to keep prices higher. And that's what the competition authorities are looking for. They're looking for an instance where one firm can dominate so much that it can drive market trends, or that there's too few firms that are potentially able to collude with one another to keep prices higher. And again, it's about this competition, but also innovation. The competition authorities don't want to see innovation harmed. Typically, if there's lots of market participants, participants that are trying to work their way into the sector can drive innovation in a way that can be really positive for the marketplace and positive for consumers. But if the market's locked up by too few big players, that can create what's called a barrier to entry. It makes it too expensive for small businesses to make it in that industry, and it tends to lock them out. So these are the kinds of calculations that the competition authorities undertake. And while we don't, and I should say, the competition authorities are they're very secretive about their math. They issue statements and summaries, et cetera. But some economists, independent economists, have done analyses of these mergers, assuming that they were going forward as proposed. And they came up with numbers that show high levels of concentration. High levels in the HHI, this is for the US, where you can see even before the mergers they were verging on highly concentrated markets and more concentrated after. And with the CR4 ratios on the global scale, it's looking pretty concentrated. So what happens when there's too much concentration is that a competition authority will say to the companies, okay, we don't like what you're doing if you do it the way you want it, you do it the way we want it. You have to divest this particular business in this jurisdiction. You have to sell that. You have to, do all these things. It's called a remedy. And so when the mergers get announced, you often see in the newspapers, it's conditional on the sale of a particular subsidiary or something like that. So how have things panned out? In terms of the state of the approvals so far, ChemChina Syngenta, this merger was finally went through all the approvals in the spring of 2017 and was completed in June. This merger came with some conditions. It's interesting, the Canadian Competition Bureau did not require any remedies, but the European Union did, and then the US did, which was to sell some of the generic business that was owned, the generic pesticide business owned by ChemChina. The Dow DuPont merger also made it through. In late June, most of the approvals came through, and the deal was completed in late August 2017, also with conditions. The conditions on this merger were a bit more stringent than the ChemChina Syngenta one. The conditions here were to sell significant parts of the research and development for crop spray chemicals in the US and the EU and in Canada. So big remedy here, but it was given approval. What's really interesting is that the Bayer Monsanto is still ongoing. And I should say these reviews can take months and months and months. And this has been delayed for another 6 months because in August 2017, the European Union launched what they called an in-depth probe into the Bayer-Monsanto merger because they were concerned about a couple of issues. And I should say that Bayer and Monsanto were the biggest companies to start with, and they're the ones merging, so they're going to have a giant market share. And the authorities, the competition authorities, are quite worried about the seed sector, the pesticide sector, as well as the bundling into digital platforms. These are all issues that they put forward as major concerns. So that's interesting. We'll see what happens with that. Full assessment is due very soon, in March. So this all, this little foray into how do competition bureaus work is interesting, but what about sustainability? This is really interesting to me. Sustainability is one of the key issues and flashpoints in the debate about the mergers. And what's interesting is that if I read through all the competition guidelines of the major players, there is zero mention of environment or sustainability in any of these documents. And well, maybe that's not surprising. Their mandate is to evaluate competition, innovation, and prices. It is not about issues of the environment and sustainability. So we have an issue where sustainability is a big part of the debate. It is not a big part of the regulation. So it's interesting, competition authorities, as I said, they're typically quite secretive. They do seek information from particular stakeholders. They will, you can go to the website of the Competition Bureau and fill out a little form and click send and give your input, which is all very good in the name of sort of participation and transparency. But it's very clear that they do not have a mandate to deal with some of the biggest issues that are on the minds of the public, which is these issues of sustainability. And I just want to give the example of the European Union. So the European Union, Margrethe Vestager, who is the competition authority, when she launched her probe of Bayer-Monsanto, she issued a public letter to what she says the petitioners, because they had a petition with 1 million signatures on it asking to stop that merger on sustainability and health and safety grounds. They had 50,000 emails and 5,000 letters. That's in addition to the 1 million signatures. And she felt this need to write back to people and say, here, I don't know if you can read what it says, but she's basically saying, yeah, these are important issues, but they do not form the basis of a review of a merger. In other words, she's bound by the mandate of her agency, which is simply to evaluate for competition, prices, and innovation. So on the one hand, you can see why competition authorities don't want to look at questions of sustainability. They basically want to have a depoliticized process based on strict metrics that are coming from the field of economics and econometrics. In a sense, they want the process to be free of bias. They don't want to have lobbying influencing decisions. And the reason that they don't want that is because they want a degree of predictability. They want companies to basically locate in their own jurisdiction, so they don't want to dissuade them from investing in their country. So to do that, they need clear and transparent rules about how they're going to evaluate things like mergers and acquisitions. So it makes sense, in an economic sense, why countries don't include these kind of issues, what we call the public interest, in their evaluation of a merger or acquisition. But on the other hand, you could say, well, we're living in this modern era where we have deeply complex problems, complicated by climate change. The whole future of food security and humanity rests on the sustainability of our food systems. Maybe we should be taking these issues of the public interest into account when evaluating these kind of economic situations. So it's interesting that we have a situation where both sides of the debate argue that sustainability is a key issue in the context of these mergers. If sustainability was evaluated, I'm sure both sides would be quite happy with that because they could make their arguments. But the problem is we don't have a governance forum that enables this public conversation to take place. As I already said, the competition authorities are located at the domestic level. We don't have any kind of global forum for discussion. The competition authorities can't look at environmental issues. Meanwhile, environmental treaties, organizations, et cetera, they have no mandate to look at issues of corporate consolidation and competition. And food security agencies also have no authority to look at these issues. So it's an interesting situation, which I would call a fragmented governance landscape. The governance of these issues, even though we have this very complicated issue where everything's interlinked, the governance of it is spread across a number of organizations, and nobody really knows who's responsible for the question of sustainable agriculture. And I think that's a big issue that we have today, is we need to think about and what kind of governance mechanisms could possibly help us work towards a solution or a compromise or some kind of way that we can move forward to promote more sustainable agriculture, because the future of food security depends on it. But we have this very difficult situation. I put a picture up here from the Committee on World Food Security, which is it's a committee that's out of the United Nations, and it meets every year in Rome. And it's supposed to be the foremost agency that deals with food issues. Interestingly, some NGOs tried to get the question of the mergers on the agenda of the Committee on World Food Security, and they were told that's got to be a side event, it's got to be civil society only. The governments did not sanction or request or require any sort of government debate about this issue. So in a way, it gets pushed to the side. But I would argue that the more that we push this issue to the side in these kind of governance forums, the more we end up with a polarized debate that takes place outside of those contexts. So just to sum up, I would say, recapping what I said, the recent agribusiness mergers are a product of both technological development and the financial conditions in the world economy today. Most people agree that the mergers matter for sustainability, but they have very different viewpoints about how exactly it matters. And regulators assess the competition effects at the domestic level, but they don't take sustainability implications into account, either at the national or at the global level. So my concluding point really is that we lack an appropriate governance forum for public debate on these issues, especially the environmental implications of corporate consolidation. And I would say that until we do have that forum, we're likely to continue to talk past one another. And I think it's really important, and just to say that when I spoke with Miles about this lecture some months ago, he said the point of this lecture is to encourage discussion and debate amongst the audience members. And so I really put this forward to you to think about, do we need a public forum? How can we achieve that public forum? And how can we move this conversation forward? So with that, I will end and happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. We will have a question and answer period now. We have 2 volunteers that will be roaming the theater with microphones. We're going to limit questions from 2 members of the audience in the theater. Today we're not quite equipped for taking lecture questions for the people via live stream, but anyone listening from the live stream that does have a question, they can please send me an email, or there's Sharon's email on the Bentley Lecture website. You can send it to her, and we'll get back to you in the coming days. So anyone who has a question, please raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you.
Yeah, it's a very excellent presentation. I saw that you brought the issues of starvation or food shortage, and same time food wastage. But I think that the people, when they talk about that 60% of the food, more food is needed by year 2050. I don't know what kind of bases they use, what are their bases, because the way I have read that we produce more than 15% of the food we need. And then also, we waste more than 30%. And whenever we want to produce more food, it needs the resources. And the resources, the main resources is water. And in many countries, water is becoming a short. I will give you the example from Punjab. I'm from Punjab, India. We started irrigation in in early 70s. We started growing 2 crops, wheat and rice. Our water table at that time was 10 feet, and now it's 110 feet. And very, very soon we will hit the rock. So that means there will be no water. There will be no water even to drink very soon. So I think we should, whenever we talk about sustainability, we should consider about those resources, and same time food wastage. That should be a part of the discussion for food security.
Right.
Thank.
Is it okay to go ahead and answer? Yeah, no, thanks for your question. And it opens a whole set of issues that are really complicated, but I think they're ones we need to grapple with. You asked first, what is the basis on which that kind of prediction is made? It's typically made on the assumption that we will continue the kind of eating patterns that we have today, which is rising meat consumption in developing countries, high caloric kind of diet, certain patterns, which requires a lot more production of grain, for example, to feed animals to make up for a higher meat-based diet. So that's what that prediction is based on. But if you make assumptions, if you tweak the assumptions that people will eat less meat because they realize it has a higher carbon intensity, then you need to maybe produce less food. It's also based on the kind of mix that we have right now, where a lot of agricultural production is actually going for biofuels and other kinds of industrial processes. It's not necessarily going for human consumption. So that's one set of issues, which is the whole diet issue, which I think is very important. But you're absolutely right that some people would argue if we want to ensure the future of humanity in general, like we're going to run out of resources if we continue things the way we are, we have to do something. We have to change something. So it's either diets have to change, agricultural production methods have to change, or both. And I don't know if that answers your question, but it's certainly very important, but also very complex.
Same time, like whenever we talk about people are starving or they're undernourished, in those countries, those people, they cannot afford food. It's not because there's a food shortage, but they cannot afford.
Exactly, and that's an issue. That's where I've spent much of my career, is looking at the global economic dimensions of hunger, because a lot of the reason that people are poor in many parts of the world and can't afford food has to do with the way that we've organized global economies that tend to exacerbate inequality. So in my perspective, we can't separate trade policy, investment policy, et cetera, from food policy. Yet we tend to, in our current governance framework, we tend to think global economic issues are one thing and global food issues are another. They are so intertwined that we have to consider them together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question over there.
Hi. Over the last 30 years, through the increased use of technology and the role of corporations in our food supply, do you think there's been do you think farmers have seen a net flow of benefits in their operations?
From high tech, from the increasing technology in farming?
Technology, and then of course mergers and everything.
Right. No, it's a really good question, and I would say, I mean, I can make some general comments, but it really depends on, detailed studies that need to be done and which farmer groups might benefit or be harmed by certain types of consolidation in the marketplace. On the one hand, you could argue that the consolidation has led to technologies that has enabled farmers to, for example, spend less time weeding, because they can use these like easier solutions of the seeds and the chemicals that work together, and that sort of thing. But it also increases costs for farmers to buy those kinds of technologies. And what we see is that the prices of those technologies tends to go up like this, but if you have a farming background, you know agricultural commodity prices go like this. And so there are periods in which commodity prices are falling and input prices are staying the same. Those are really tough years for farmers. So it's hard to say like over the long run about the net benefits. It really depends on the time period that you're talking about, et cetera. But in terms of the two perspectives I laid out, the critics would argue that we need to get farmers away from being dependent on annual purchase of inputs and instead, work with the agroecological system in a low high-tech input, a low input environment, versus others who would argue that those technologies are saving time and that farmers can, for example, have multiple means of earning income if farming is made easier for them. So it's a really good question, but I'm sorry I don't have a really straightforward answer. But I think that the point that commodity prices are very volatile, and that's historically been the case for agricultural commodities, it just creates a whole level of uncertainty for farmers. And so that question of dependence, I think, is a really, really important one. And this particular moment, we're seeing low and falling commodity prices up against this prospect. That's why many people are concerned right now, is they're worried the mergers will lead to higher input prices at a time when commodity prices are low, and that's not at all a winning combination for farmers. Thanks.
In a highly financialized environment that you really nicely described, I thought, where corporate agribusiness and concentrated corporate agribusiness seems to have this competitive advantage due to the access to monetary resources. And then taking a step forward to your governance angle, would you think, or what would you think, should governments be actively investing more in this agroecological alternative system as to give this system a competitive balance or countervailing balance against corporate agriculture? Because it also tends to be correlated with the poor small-scale agriculture that you said feeds about 70% of the world. So is that the governance response to take public investment into agroecological systems?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and if I had another hour, I would have gone in that direction. I absolutely think, that we need to look at this history, which is why I really wanted to spend time on it, is that we saw agricultural research go from public sector to private sector. It went from a public good to a private profit-making enterprise. But do we have to stay with it as a profit-making enterprise? Can we go back to public research in agriculture in agroecological production? I think definitely. We have the capacity to put all kinds of resources towards agroecological research, but we don't. Very little research money from governments or at the international level is going towards agroecology. There's a bit more now. There's a bit of an uptick right now. The FAO is quite interested in it. The key is getting governments interested in investing as a public good in agroecological solutions. And it might be that we need some kind of mix, right? Some kind of attention to the high-tech farming, but also attention to the more low-tech farming. And that's probably where we'll end up, but I do think governments need to pay attention and put more resources towards that kind of research activity. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Delton Jubenville, Jennifer, and I have, you answered those last two questions great, by the way, and that helped answer some of my concerns. But there's an extreme amount of uncertainty in agriculture today. For example, when I was young, very passionate about becoming a farmer. Now I don't even know the definition of a farmer. I Googled it. It isn't even certain, and Google is pretty certain on a lot of things. It's actually a little bit depressing, and I really encourage my boy to become a farmer, and I'm passionate about that. But when I don't even know what that is, it scares me. You know, Bayer's and Monsanto's, the word chemical became a poison to them. They don't want to be associated with that word. Well, it is their business. They have no choice. Us as a farmer, when we truly define ourselves, we should not be associated with that word. I do not believe it has room in the definition of a farmer. Do you know what the definition of farmer is?
It's a good question. What is Google's definition?
Google it has uncertain definitions and multiple, and some are ill-educated, you know,
Right.
is an example of a farmer. So it's just, I guess, do you feel the same way I'm feeling, that there is an extreme amount of uncertainty of what a farmer even is
No,
nowadays?
it's a good question. The industry is really changing, and there's such diversity. There's, you know, in the developing world, we see, you know, lots. There's 500 million small-scale farms, like under 2 hectares, whereas in, you know, this part of Canada, farms are gigantic. So there's, like, even the definition of a small farm in Canada could be, as Miles was telling me, a small farm could be 600 acres. Could be?
That's a really small farm.
Yes.
That's a really small farm. That's astounding to somebody from India, right? With a very small plot of land. Yeah, and some people describe farmers as like high-tech business people, right? And others define them as people working the land to bring forth food. There's different ways that can be done, for sure, but we have a wide variety around the world of how we produce food.
Okay, yeah, I like that gentleman's point on, is it time for government to step in and encourage how we want to see farming, the people, the government, that us, you know, is it time that we micro-merge ourselves, you know, build power in our unions, farmers union, for example, and work side by side with our governments and our education systems to really define farmer, you know?
I agree with you. I think it's really important. The reason that governments put a lot of effort 150 years ago into public research for agriculture was it was about nation building. It was about providing security to have a safe and secure nation. It was to have a decent food supply. Today we live in this globalized world economy where people are saying, well, we don't need to produce food because we can just import it from another country. And then you never know where the buck stops in that kind of situation. And I think governments have taken a back step and they've let corporations do most of the research and development. But I think it would be wise for governments to pay more attention rather than in the case I mentioned of just sort of stepping back and saying, you know, sustainability is not an issue for competition. I think maybe it should be. And that requires exactly what you're saying, thinking through what kind of farming we want to have in this country, but also around the world.
Okay, thank you for the great presentation, and I like the way you think, Jennifer.
Pass the mic to the person in front of you there, and then we'll have John's question.
Thanks for a really interesting and very well presented presentation. Much enjoyed it. The question I have is pretty simple. Do you know if there's any evidence at all that these mergers actually lead to increased investment in broad spectrum research about agriculture, as opposed to very narrow research in increasing profit through marketing and other kinds of things of that nature? Has there been a study like that to show us what goes on and how it matches the claims?
Right, that's a great question, and thank you. There actually are some studies out of the USDA in the past couple of years on this very question, on research and development in the agricultural sector and the relationship to corporate consolidation. What these studies have found is that in the initial stages of the mergers that started to take place in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, there was a big uptick in research and development, in crop yields and traits and use with chemicals and whatnot. But after that period, like in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a lot less new and innovative research coming out of it. And I would stress that with these mergers, if you remember when they were announced, this was back in 2015 and 2016, a lot of the press releases and the newspaper stories were talking about synergies. And this was a euphemism for cuts. And they were cutting mostly the research and development departments because they didn't want to have duplicative research. And that was a big push for the mergers to happen. So it was about cost saving in that instance. And you do have to wonder how much innovation is actually coming out of it. The European Union's investigation of the Bayer-Monsanto merger actually specifically identifies the concern that it will lead to reduced research and development innovation. And what's interesting is that the competition authorities, what they do is they look at these numbers and then they'll issue a request for documents. And so they'll ask the companies to make submissions. And this is all private, by the way. We can't access this as researchers, so it's unfortunate because I would love to do some sort of independent analysis. But from what I've gleaned from the reports coming out of these agencies, is they have a big concern that the companies did not make a sufficient argument to justify their claim that there would be more research and development and innovation. So that is definitely a big concern.
Yeah, John pretty much hit on my question, actually, at least part of it. Yeah, you've got a weird regulatory regime where you got these two kind of big economic concentration indicators, and that's what determines whether a merger can go ahead. But you said there's kind of a squishy one, which is that the companies can make a case that they increase, I believe it's just one thing, innovation, right?
Yeah, efficiency, which would lead to lower prices.
Okay, efficiency then, right? Yeah, that was my question then. So if there have been studies on, say, innovation and its relation to corporate concentration, is there any studies in relation to, say, the relative viabilities of, say, agroecology versus these sort of big input-intensive forms of agriculture in efficiency? Is there a metric that one can use to go against arguments like that or for them?
Right. No, this is a really good question, and as I was putting this presentation together, it really sort of cemented the point in my head that the efficiency exception shows that the regulators are kind of on the same page as the companies because they have a similar definition of efficiency. I don't know if you think about the term efficiency, it could mean a whole lot of things. It could mean energy efficiency, resource, like it could be efficient use of land. It could be, there's lots of ways you could define efficiency. But if it's termed in economic efficiency terms, then you get a different kind of outcome. I don't know if that makes sense. But the regulators are using economic efficiency and they're looking at its impact on prices. And they're not looking at resource efficiency, et cetera. So the studies you're talking about, there are studies showing that there's more efficient use of resources in an agroecological system compared to maybe a more high-tech, modern conventional farming system. But that's not the same efficiency metric that they would be using at a regulator and a regulator's desk, if that makes sense. So it's kind of complicated, but I think that this issue of efficiency is one that we need to sort of dive into theoretically and think about and come up with different ways that we can talk about it, because I think we need to maybe bring up more of these kind of energy efficiency understandings as opposed to economic efficiencies if we really want to think seriously about sustainability. We need a better balance because right now the way the rules are written, it prioritizes economic efficiency over other kinds of efficiency. I don't know if that answers your question, but anyway, there's just so many studies out there and they are so contradictory to one another. There's one making the case that if we stop growing GMOs today, we would see a huge increase in carbon emissions. There's another study arguing that if we adopt agroecology today, we'll see a huge decrease in carbon emissions. You can almost pick your perspective and then go look for the study and you will find it, which is interesting.
My concern is that the Mayo Clinic did a study and found that in the last 50 years, there's 4 times more celiac disease than there were 50 years ago. Cancer rates are very high. Autism is very high. How do we cut these chemicals? And it's very worrying to me that these big mergers are going ahead. And I heard a farmer from India say, he has a small holding, that the health of his workers enormously improved. He had better crops when he cut out buying all these chemicals. And so it really is a big concern to me that these mergers are going on. And I think we need to write to our MPs and people and express our concerns.
Thanks. No, this is a great question. In fact, I just wanted to pick up on the health issue that you mentioned, because a study was published just a couple of months ago in California. They were testing urine of a sample of adults over the course of 20 years, and what they saw in that 20 years was that glyphosate, which is Roundup herbicide, was basically negligible in people's urine in California that they were testing in this sample of thousands of people. And 20 years later, it increased by like a factor of 500, which is just incredible. So this is a new data point that we have, and we're trying to make sense of it. There's still a lot of debate about the carcinogenic properties of, whether glyphosate is carcinogenic or not. That's another big debate, and I don't understand all the health ins and outs of it. But you're right that a lot of people are linking the greater use of this particular chemical to a lot of problems like celiac and other kinds of problems. I think that the jury's still out on the linkage between these issues, but I think it's one that a number of scientists are definitely working on. But you make a good point about small holdings, and that's one point I wish I had emphasized more in the talk, is just that there's a really interesting paradox out there that small farms tend to have higher productivity per land area than large farms. But at the same time, large farms have higher yields for particular crops than small farms. And this is a weird paradox, but it shows that these two different perspectives have very different ways in which they're measuring productivity. One is about the yield of a specific crop, and the other is about the productivity of the land as a whole. And those are really important issues that comes back to your efficiency question that we really need to grapple with, because as we move forward and more people on the planet, and we're trying to have sustainable food security, what do we need to prioritize? Is it productivity of healthy food, or is it yield? And that comes back to your farmer question. Exactly. What is the farmer? Is a farmer maximizing yield or productivity?
Productivity of healthy food. That's what it is. That's what we should be concentrating on. Healthy food. Optimizing the food for human health, right?
Okay, we got one back here and then one over there. And so first, Elizabeth, and then the final question will be yours.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Just wondering if this is yet another example of why don't we follow the money? If you look at that old documentary, Food Incorporated, you see that the executives in some of the top chemical companies, agrochemical companies, just rotate the door into the head of government and then back again. So these very powerful, rich corporations are showing what's called regulatory capture or corporate capture of regulations. Why would they permit all these government agencies to tell them they can't merger? It's just not going to happen. So I think, as this gentleman in front of me and others have suggested, we really need to band together as people who would like to work at a smaller, less well-funded level. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. I knew I had too many slides, but the one I wanted to add was about lobbying. So I figured it would be a question, so I'm very glad you asked the question. Corporate lobbying is a huge, huge issue, and what you mentioned is this phenomenon called the revolving door, where we see executives from these companies going into the regulatory agencies and back again, and they tend to revolve through. Part of the rationale for that is perhaps you need people with industry experience to understand how to regulate the industry, but it also creates a conflict of interest, which is a huge problem. There's also organizations that track the lobby funds that have been spent by these very companies, and it's really eye-opening. I recommend, if you're interested, to go and look at those data. Because millions and millions and millions is spent every year by lobbyists, either from these companies or from industry associations that represent the industry. So sometimes there's like a different layer. There's the companies, and then there's a advocacy group who lobby the government. And you don't really know, in a way, following that money, exactly how it's spent. But some researchers have shown that there has been a specific effort in the US, in any case, to lobby for the promotion of a large-scale agriculture over organic or smaller scale agriculture. So definitely the policy process is affected. So it's interesting that they try to have a sort of unbiased regulatory process, but at the same time, the policymakers are themselves, yeah, there's a lot of money, for sure.
Okay, final question at the back.
Thank you very much. Can you hear it? Okay. The question here is, listen, thank you very much. I think you gave a very good talk, and I'm very glad to have been here. So we're at a university. Members of the public could possibly be expected to think that the universities have a certain capacity to render some clarity on some of these questions in a way that might help governments make up their minds of what to do. And also, I mean, we've got climate change coming up. We've got a few things coming up that are really, really tough, I think. And so, what has been the role of universities now? The corporations have talked very much about innovation, and they've talked a lot about efficiency. Have universities actually contribute to what, in the field of agriculture, is considered efficiency? It can't be just crop yield, because you've got a soil quality that you have to be able to maintain in some way. So how do you measure efficiency? Then again, how do you measure innovation? A lot of innovation, if you just have another GMO crop or just another kind of plant, are you really, is that innovation? So I'm asking you, what is the role of universities and how are you doing so far?
That's a really good question. I'm afraid of saying anything because I might offend somebody.
Although it's a great entry point to say we've got some amazing posters out there. They're talking about these topics. So I welcome you to have a look there.
Right. Yeah. Plug for the posters. I think it's a really good question. Just to say, from the government's side, like there's more money for research if you partner with industry than if you just do it on your own. And I will just say that. It answers your question a little bit, maybe.
All right. So let's thank Jennifer once more. Thank you for all your questions. Again, I encourage you to please stick around and discuss the lecture with anyone who you want to discuss it with. Please view the posters. And those of you who are going to attend the dinner later will meet at the Faculty Club at 6 p.m. So thanks once again.
Thank you.